Hi folks, it's Dr. DiBiase, and we're going to continue our conversation about process and response. And we're going to focus a little bit more on the response end of things in this video. So, as you're going to see, we're going to be doing a decent amount of peer response in class. And peer response is simply providing feedback to one another on the tasks that you are working on, right? So you're working on these sort of common essays, and you'll be able to provide each other feedback on those essays in a structured way, and we'll talk more about that as we go. But why do this? Why use peer response instead of relying exclusively on feedback from your professor? Well, one, I think the peer response process helps develop collaboration skills, which are very important. It provides you an opportunity to work through common problems with someone else, because odds are if you are struggling with something in your paper, it's possible that another writer might be struggling with something similar, and by working together you can come to some sort of solution. It provides an opportunity for reader-focused feedback. The feedback that you receive from your peer is going to be different than the feedback you receive from me or from your professor in another class. And that's important because there are different ways of reading and there are different ways of thinking about how we provide feedback to one another. And so both forms can be useful, and I'll talk a little bit more about this towards the end of the video. Finally, I think that peer response is a really good way to develop and grow as writers and as readers, because as you are reading other people's work, you will see them doing things that you maybe hadn't thought to do in your own work. And in doing so, you expand your repertoire of possible avenues to explore in your own writing. This is really common as you're making your way into new writing experiences as you're learning what it means to write in a particular discipline, for example. You begin to borrow, not the specific wording, but you might borrow some of the argumentative strategies or frameworks that you see appearing in other academic works that you see. And so seeing what your peers are doing can offer you some a new window into your own work, and I think there's a lot of value in that. So what makes peer response work? And I think that this is an important question to be asking, because I'm sure we've all had experiences of doing peer response that have gone poorly, or even getting feedback that just hasn't been very useful. Whether that is feedback from a teacher that left you confused as to what the issues in your writing happened to be, or that you felt were overly critical, or that just did not inspire you to continue progressing in your writing. And so I would suggest that there are at least 4 things that make peer response work. One is sort of an attitude of generous reading, making assumptions of good faith, having intentionality and context awareness, and practice. And we'll touch on all of those briefly. So what does it mean to read generously? First, you have to assume that your writer did their best given the context. Now, is that always going to be the case? Probably not, right? But I think it is much more healthy to go into reading someone's paper assuming that what they have put together is the best that they could do in the given moment, given the constraints that they were facing. So that you aren't going in with the assumption that the person, if you see an issue in a paper, you don't want to go in assuming, well, there's an issue because this person didn't put in the work. Now, maybe that's true, maybe they didn't, but that's not helpful for the purpose of, you can't do anything about that at this point. And so it's better to assume that they're doing their best so that you can be in the right mindset to give productive feedback. You also want to assume that the writer is making good faith arguments. If you are reading someone else's paper and they're making an argument that you do not agree with, you want to assume that at least if they are making that argument, they're doing it in an honest and sincere way. And I think that that is really critical so that you don't get distracted in the purpose of trying to help them advance their case. Tied to this is the idea of keeping an open mind, right? So be open to what the writer is doing. In fact, when you look at the peer response instructions for this assignment that we're working on, you will see that the first thing I ask you to do when you read the paper is just to read it, but don't make any comments. Because if someone's doing something differently than the way you might do it, or they're approaching the assignment in a way that you don't think is the right way to approach it, you don't want to jump to conclusions, right? You want to see where it goes, especially in an early draft, because maybe they're onto something, right? Maybe they've figured out a different way of approaching the task, and maybe it wouldn't work for you, but maybe it works in the context of what they're trying to do. So again, keep an open mind. And then finally, read for what is working, more than for what isn't, right? I think it's really important to focus our attention on what is working in a paper and calling the writer's attention to that, so that they can understand why that section or that phrase or that idea worked for you as a reader, and they can think about how they might apply the same approach to other areas of their paper. So I keep using this term good faith. What does that mean? And I touched on this again briefly, right? It's the assumption that all actors in a situation are acting honestly and are being sincere. And this is particularly important when you are the writer trying to make sense of the feedback that you are being given by a peer in the class. If the goal is to help everyone develop as writers, then you have to assume, even if it might be awkwardly worded, that the response that you are receiving is truly intended to help you progress. Not to belittle you, not to make you feel bad about yourself as a writer, not to quibble over, semantics, but to help you forward your thinking and your writing process. And that can be really difficult to do, and I can absolutely appreciate that, because especially when you put a lot of time and energy and effort into a piece of writing, it is difficult to take criticism and not take it at least a little bit personally. But the reality is that we're going into this collaboratively. We're going into this to try and help each other grow as writers, and that's important to try and keep in mind as you're looking at the feedback that you receive from the other students in the class. And I think this is also really important because I've seen some students make this kind of error in judgment. Don't think that you're better than anyone else when you are receiving feedback, right? I have had students before bristle at being paired with a student that they felt was, not as good of a writer as they were and didn't feel they could get anything out of that feedback. That is not true, right? The person who's working with you may not be as proficient in writing as you might be, but they can probably read your stuff and let you know where it's not making sense to them. And if they tell you that, then I don't care how good you think you are, you need to revisit what you're doing. And this is a lesson that I had to learn as well. So I'm not calling anyone out. I'm just saying that this is something to keep in mind. Let's talk about intentionality. So intentionality means kind of having a reason for doing what you're doing. And I like to tie this back to Lamont's kind of stages of drafting, right? So, the shitty first draft, the updraft, the dental draft. Here we'll talk about as early, later, and final drafts. But the sense here is that when you are giving feedback, that feedback has to be contextual. And so, for example, if we are early in a draft, this is not the time to be commenting on the writer's punctuation or spelling or, whether or not a comma goes in a particular place or whether the word choice is the best kind of word choice. Now, obviously, if you encounter a sentence that is incredibly confusing, you may want to bring their attention to that because it's impeding your ability to get their meaning. But really in the early drafts, we're thinking about big ideas. We're looking for areas of growth. We're trying to help the individual figure out how they want to shape their argument or their ideas. We're not going to start worrying too much about the particulars of sentence construction at this point, especially not as the peer responder. That's something that I might comment on if I see a pattern that's worth commenting on. But barring that, your focus in these early drafts are on sort of bigger picture issues to help the reader, help the writer make the most progress as they move into the next stage of their writing. Now, once we get into later drafts and we start thinking about we've sort of figured out the shape of the argument. Now we're really talking more about executing the vision of the writer, right? What are areas where that vision sort of gets disrupted? We might look at some other, some organizational changes. We might look at, how they are executing some of their, their source references, etc. And here we can start narrowing our vision a little bit. And then once we get to the final drafts, then that's where we start looking at these things that we might call local order concerns, right? Or lower order concerns. Sentence level word choice, sentence structure, etc. So that, the final version looks does what it needs to do as effectively as it can. But again, right now we're doing feedback on the early drafts, and so I don't want people making comments on one another's papers about comma usage, etc. That is not your responsibility in this moment. Which leads me to the idea of context, right? You're not the teacher, right? and that's not, I'm not saying that to be dismissive of you. I'm saying that because you have a different role to play, right? I tell this to my kids all the time, right? My daughter will like correct my son or tell him to stop doing something, and I have to remind her that her job is to enjoy herself. My job is to be the parent, right? As the reader, your job is to emphasize your experience as a reader with that particular text. As a reader, what made sense to you? As a reader, what did you want to know more about? As a reader, what really resonated with your understanding of the material, right? It's my job as the teacher to be focusing more on things like the degree to which the assignment meets the requirements, the way in which the source usage, whether or not examples are strong or weak, etc. But your focus, right, is to, again, relate as a peer to your fellow writer, and ground your response in the experience as a reader. And I actually think this is really important because I've had students before been very anxious about giving peer feedback because they'll say, Dr. D, I am not the strongest writer, I'm not a particularly good writer, or the person I'm being paired with, I know they're a really good writer, so I'm not sure what I can say. And my point is always, like, you may not be a filmmaker, but when you go to see a movie, you can kind of comment on whether or not it worked as a film, right? Or you can talk about what you liked or what you didn't like, or what was confusing or what was really clear or well shot. In a similar way, you may not consider yourself the best writer or the most effective writer, but you've got lots of experience reading, and you can speak to the truth of that experience when you're providing feedback. So I think that that's sort of a very liberating approach to take with this particular kind of feedback. Finally, what makes this work is practice. We will get better at doing this as we make our way through the next couple of weeks, and you'll get better at doing this as you make your way through your career at Fairfield. Providing response is a skill. It takes practice to feel, you need experience to start feeling comfortable in taking, a more critical stance towards the writers that you're working with. It takes practice to learn how to articulate yourself in a way that helps the writer get the most out of the feedback that you are providing. And so even if this doesn't come very easily at first, you're going to have more opportunities to be doing this throughout the course, and certainly once the course is over. So how do we give better feedback? So let's go through a couple of things that we can do. First, it's important to explain your reasoning. I never found anything as frustrating as a student as when I would get a paper back from a professor and there'd be like one sentence, not even a sentence, like one word in the margin saying something like awkward or not great. Well, what do you mean by that? What made it awkward? What made it not great? Without that kind of explanation, it's hard to understand how to improve in that particular area. And you'll see that in the assignment that I'm giving you to do in terms of peer response, I am asking you to be really explicit in explaining why you responded in the way that you did. We talked about this a little bit before, but again, focus on the reader experience. Lock in on the idea that you can provide good feedback as a reader because you can speak to the truth of what it was like to read through the material. You can honestly talk about where you found yourself getting confused and why you might have been confused there. You can talk about what you found to be interesting and what you want to learn more about. You can talk about areas where you want to hear more information or see more examples. You can talk about areas that you felt went really, really well and why. And those are things that no matter how good of a writer you think you are, you can certainly do as a reader. So don't let your perception of how good or bad of a writer you are impact your confidence in your ability to provide feedback to someone else. Again, and this is tied a little bit to explain your reasoning, but be specific, right? I ask you in the response assignment to quote from the essay that you're reading. It's really important to show the writer where things are happening on the page so that they can make the most informed decisions about how they want to respond to that feedback as they make their way through the revising process. Balance criticism and praise. I think this kind of goes without saying, particularly if you were looking at the Straub reading for this week. It is okay to be critical of someone's writing and to point out areas where things are not doing what they need to do for you as a reader. That doesn't mean you're necessarily right in your critique, but it's fair to make those points and to say, hey, I found this section really confusing, or hey, you raised this question here, but you don't really answer it, or hey, I really do think this section would work better if you did, X. But you also want to balance that by telling the person what they did well, because as I keep mentioning, you can learn a lot from hearing what you did well, right? You can learn a lot from someone pointing out, hey, I really loved this particular sentence because I think it, the way that you structured it made it crystal clear what you were trying to do. Or, hey, I really like the way that you incorporated this source because it was really, really evident how it fit into your argument. Or, hey, I really love this transition because it did a really good job of connecting old information to new information, and that made reading this section a lot easier for me to parse, to make sense of. So again, you want a balance here, and what I've asked you to do for the response assignment, you'll see a little bit of that balance. And then finally, and I'm going to preface this by saying that this is cheesy as hell, but it's something that we hear about in even my daughter's like kindergarten class, right? The idea of being respectful and to think. So what does that mean? So when you are providing your feedback, you want to think about the following things, right? And again, I realize that this is really, really cheesy. Just please bear with me, right? But is the feedback that you're providing, is the response you're providing true, right? So if you're saying something makes sense, or you're saying, this really worked for you, right? Or you thought this was a very good, sentence. Are you saying that just to be polite, or are you saying because you sincerely feel like this is the best thing that's going on in the piece, and if so, why, right? Similarly, right, you shouldn't critique something just for the sake of critiquing it. You want to make sure that if you're giving the feedback and you're telling someone that something needs work, that you genuinely believe that that is the case. You want to think about whether the response is helpful, right? So again, telling somebody that something doesn't work or isn't particularly good is not especially helpful because it doesn't help the individual figure out what the next steps are, right? So if you're going to offer a criticism, you want to, again, explain why you're making the criticism and how they might begin to address it. Even if you're not entirely sure how to do that, right? You can offer some suggestions. And similarly, it's not very helpful to just say, well, that's good, I don't know what else to say, right? Or I really liked that. If it stops at, oh, I liked that, that doesn't help the writer understand why you liked it or how they might apply what you liked about that particular quote or section to other parts of their work. Is it inspiring? Again, very cheesy, but when I say inspiring, right, is it the kind of feedback that is going to lead your writer to want to engage in revision? And I can definitely remember, when I was a student, you get back this paper that might be covered in comments or red ink or whatever, and my inclination was always just to like throw it in the trash because it seemed like there was so much to do that there was no way to actually handle all of it. And so I didn't feel particularly inspired to engage with my own writing. This is why when we give feedback, we want to keep it focused, right? We want to make sure that we're referring to specific things, and we don't want to comment on every single thing that's going on in the paper, especially because you're not being graded on having a perfect paper. You're being graded on your ability to do the work. And so by giving some, just a few concrete things for people to work on, that will lead them to feel more encouraged to engage with the material because it will seem not necessarily less challenging, but it will seem more doable, right? It will not seem so overwhelming that they will not be able to start the task. And we can kind of think about this in terms of, is it necessary, right? When you're giving the comment, right, or you're deciding what to comment on, and this is more, this is less of an issue when I'm giving you sort of a more structured peer response activity, but of all the things that you can comment on, right, why is this the one, the one element of the paper that you feel like you need to comment on, right? Why do you feel like it's important enough to make a comment here? And that's really to prevent you from just commenting on every single thing in the paper and leaving the person in the writer in a spot where they feel like they can't address all of the concerns. And then finally, is what you're saying said in a kind manner, right? And again, being kind does not mean that you can't be critical. You can be critical. I will be critical of your writing, but I will try to do so in a way that is respectful of your intelligence as a writer and as a student, and in a way that leaves you feeling like you are capable to do the work that you need to do. So again, as you're giving one another responses, please keep that in mind, right? Be generous readers. Assume that people are operating in good faith. Really think about the feedback that you are providing and demonstrate that effort. Because if you do, not only will your writer benefit, but I assure you that your own writing is going to improve as well. So good luck with responding to one another's pieces, and take care.